Well, welcome in. Here we go. It's May the 28th, a Wednesday, as we record this episode of Now and Next. It's good of you to join us. And by the way, this week we'll also have another episode of the pod. It will include our cast, our comms and strategy team. That will be Bob Reed, Anne-Marie Akins, and Lindsay Broadhead. And we'll get into some of the comms strategies and failures of the week. And then there have been a few as they come and they go. But it's been a bit of an historic week here in this part of the world on a whole number of levels, not the least of which is the speech from the throne was delivered on Tuesday of this week. And what made it remarkable, of course, is King Charles was in the legislature, in the Senate, to deliver that throne speech. And there are a whole bunch of reasons why that was significant. As far as the sovereign being in the speaker's chair, etc. That's one thing. The tone of it against the backdrop of our conversations, such as they are with the United States and Donald Trump. But this sets the legislative agenda for the new government, Mark Carney. And by all accounts, that throne speech was a success. Take out the fact that people will argue eternally about whether or not we need the monarchy or not, and that's another show. But part of that was, and a lot of the media focused on affordability, which is understandable. But I listened a lot for the conversation around security and around sovereignty. And they came up, and they came up quite significantly. So I thought it was time to invite Scott Clancy back in. He is a retired Major General at the RCAF and knows a thing or two when it comes to our security, and particularly North American security, having sat in the director's chair at NORAD. From your seat and what you heard from the throne speech, just high level, did sovereignty and security get the attention you think it needs?
I think absolutely, Dave. I think the king hit a lot of the exact points that the government wanted him to hit. But more importantly, I think he articulated, and I hope it's straight from the heart. It really seemed to be straight from the heart. Canada is strong and free got a resounding applause. And if you were sitting, like I was in my little 1866 cottage in a small town and looking at this, I got the gravitas of the moment. I did. I'm not sure that all Canadians got the same kind of feeling from that, but I feel that the king said Canada, the sovereign nation, he was words like Canada needs to be infecting the entire world, is a beacon of democracy and values. These are the things that resonated with me. So I think that he did hit the notes. And on defense and security specifically, as it relates directly to sovereignty, he also outlined a program for the government that is at least trying to hit those key points.
And much has been made, and you and I have talked about this often, and we talked just after the inauguration of Donald Trump, and it was your assessment rather vigorously that the world is a more dangerous place with Donald Trump behind the resolute desk, and he hinted at that. He talked about the dangers that the world presents right now, and kept hearkening back to the first time the sovereign sat in that chair, and that was his mother. And the Queen delivered the speech from the throne. And it was at a time when Canada and the rest of the world was emerging from the Second World War. And that is just not part of our memory, our current memory for the most part, for most of us. But I thought it was an interesting way to pull that historic thread through to actually emphasize and punctuate. Yeah, we're in a really specific time in our history, and we need to be cautious, careful, and courageous all at once.
I like that. Cautious, careful, and courageous. Put that on a banner, and it could outline the policy approach and the emotional approach that the Canadian statesmen and women need to make with our allies, and especially with the United States. I think there's an interesting link between what the sovereign means to a nation and the words that came out of King Charles with respect to stability and how the world is a more dangerous place when you have an unstable individual in the White House. I say unstable, not because I think he's necessarily mentally unstable, but because his, how he's going to react on any given day and how the administration is going to react is not easily predicted by any other nation. What the sovereign gives to a nation, and Queen Elizabeth was the expert at this, was an element of sage advice over years and years and years. Having seen multiple governments go, it's the second head of state that knows the personalities of the people, knows how the world moves, can advise a leader, can provide advice to someone, where at the top of those things, and what Hobbes would relate to be the state of nations, leaders of governments don't have peers that they can trust, because you can't really trust, right? As we've learned, your closest ally necessarily. And some of the words that the king used, and I agreed, the government put those words there for the most part, speaks to the transactional relationship that we now have with the United States of America, as opposed to that ally, friend, court. We're still going to have those relationships with the people of the United States from a certain point of view. I have thousands of friends in the United States. We all do, family, everything. Interconnected tissue is enormous. I don't think that's going to change. But Donald Trump doesn't understand friendship like you and I understand it. It's a business related friendship. He's grown up in that environment. And it was my wife that put me onto this. He thinks differently about this. If you're in a business relationship, one day you could be, in a war against your, business opponent or whatever it is. And the next day you're cutting a deal with them and you're making them a partner. That's how you do this. That means that the relationship between adversary and ally is amorphous. And we in the security and defense sphere know that that's a very dangerous game to be playing. One, as we've seen, ally becomes adversary very quickly. What are you talking about? That's not how we do this. We place the relationship that we have with our allies above whatever transactional issue that we have. Thinks the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase, I think, is, you can't have security without certainty, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And that's sort of where we are. And to your point around the instability, that's where the problem is. Whether it's economic, whether it's defense, whether it's immigration, all of those things that the United States is dealing with. That's therein lies the challenge vis-a-vis security. But one of the lines that struck me in that speech, and I saw a little bit of media around it, but Canada was going to commit to the Rearm program, Rearm Europe program. And it was a security and freedom for Europe. Is that something like that?
Yeah.
The idea that the European Union was going to look at this, and I think it actually passed yesterday, almost around the time the throne speech was being delivered, that in fact, this is a procurement plan, but it's there to actually support European nations in the Union to be able to increase their defense spending, to make it more robust. And it isn't necessarily, I didn't read it this way anyway, maybe you know better, it isn't necessarily anything to do with NATO commitments. It is to do with the defense of Europe. And so I think really interesting, even more interesting, that we are now out loud in the throne speech committing to being part of that initiative.
Yes. So there's two ways to look at all defense initiatives as they pertain to defense and security. One is economically, and I'll include with that, goals like 2 or 5% GDP from a NATO or Western ally, defense spending perspective. And then there's the actual alliance and security elements to it. So when I take something like this apart, the first thing I do is I say, okay, all NATO nations are wanting to spend more on defense, and they want to have an ability to procure quickly from a large defense network that, quite honestly, all nations are struggling, other than the United States, which has a very robust defense industrial backbone. Everybody else is struggling with how do you do that on a continuous basis. And even Canadian defense industry, after the war in Ukraine, and the Canadian governments who said, yeah, we're going to spend more, said, okay, well, then where's the continuous commitment? And it took years for that continuous commitment, or I wouldn't even call it a real continuous commitment, to come to the industrial base. I think part of that is this. If Canada signs on to an agreement like this, if they're part and parcel to this, even though the end state of this is security in Europe, and for European nations, it's Canadian industry that also is allowed to be a part of this. This is the same thing when we bought onto the F-35 project on the front end. Sure, we'll be part of the F-35. And the monies that we spent returned 2 for 1. So government money spent for every dollar, 2 came back to Canadian industry and was dollars in the coffers of Canadians. Whether or not we purchased, we actually contracted the purchase of the F-35. We just had to say that we were going to be part of that. So from an economic point of view, things like this make sense for Canadian industry. The second one is the alliance part. I like alliances. I think they make the world more stable. I think that they're also a forum for wide and widespread diplomatic relations. So the more that you have alliance systems out there, the more that you're going to have difficult conversations behind closed doors. So, for example, it's always been a somewhat contentious relationship between Big Brother in the United States and Little Canada. And over the course of the last 30 to 40 years of my military service, I watched the Canadian defense budget shrink, and our actual capabilities wither on the vine. And this became a bone of contention with our ally down south. Whether I was, running operations in a command center or then as the director of operations for NORAD, I was asking, about what they thought, and then having to answer very, very tough questions about the diminished defense capability of Canada and why the government of Canada and the Canadian people were not committing to defense. And to the Americans, this is a visceral thing, because if you're not contributing to defense and you're a primary ally on the continent, then you're a liability. And I accept that. But the alliance allows us to have those difficult conversations, to place the relationship above whatever defense spending things in the specific government. So it divides out. You can still have your sovereignty, and you can still have tough conversations, much like we would have with our families, right? So it becomes the same thing. So that's how I see something like that. Access to Canadian industry, access to that, but as well widening our breadth of alliances.
Yeah, so the alliance in and of itself is more than a security function than you're suggesting. That
it absolutely is.
Yeah. It just that's toughening, hardening the network, if you will, to be able to kind of have those conversations to make sure that we're all contributing and carrying our weight. Having said all that, there's this preoccupation with the GDP number vis-a-vis NATO, and now all of this. The conversation about the gold dome and the last time you and I talked, I think, we were talking about that very specific idea that, there really isn't a North American security system that would prevent a missile attack right now. So, and perhaps the White House was listening to your wisdom at the time, but I think that caught a lot of Canadians off guard. That, what do you mean we don't have any way of stopping a missile attack in North America? So that's one thing. Two, the idea that he wants to do this so quickly, I don't know. Other people will know better than that. But all of a sudden, there's some urgency around that. And as memeable as that might be, I think that sense of urgency is probably necessary.
Yeah, so, Dave, you bring up the two fundamental points that came out around the Golden Dome, right? And the first one was not about where NORAD was or what NORAD modernization looked like and all those things that those of us who were in the enterprise were talking about. It's and I am going to use the word naive approach that most Canadians have towards their own defense and security. We'll see the war in Ukraine and we say, it's over there. We see the war in Afghanistan, it's over there. 9/11 didn't touch Canadian soil. Okay. Come From Away is a great musical. It's over there. Nothing's going to change my lifestyle. Nothing's going to change my economic thing. And it shows when you ask people straight up front and polling, what do you think of the Canadian Forces? How is your support for the Canadian Armed Forces in defense and security? And, 85% of the population, we support the Canadian Forces. We support the troops. Okay. Defense versus housing. Defense versus education. Defense versus healthcare. Defense versus Aboriginal affairs. Defense versus fisheries. Defense for, I can keep on going until it's at the bottom. At one point, you don't. right? And Canadians, all of those answers are based upon the fact that they have no perception of that threat. And those of us in the defense industry try to tell them Russian bombers that approach our coastlines on a routine basis, somewhere between 7 and 14 times, with multiple aircraft, fighters, bombers, and as of last year, Russian and Chinese together, approaching Canadian and American coastlines, are there to launch conventional cruise missiles. Not nuclear weapons, conventional cruise missiles. They could launch nuclear weapons, but that would signal a fundamental change in, mutual assured destruction and the things about that, because I don't think anybody's thinking about prosecuting a nuclear war anytime soon. But those conventional attacks could happen anytime, and we cannot prevent it in any way, shape, or form. NORAD tries to diminish it. The work that I was doing when I ended my career as the director of operations for NORAD was focused around exactly this, creating, if it's the Golden Dome, how about golden bubbles around specific areas of North America where you could defend that which is going to make you the most resilient, that's going to make sure that you can sustain your ways of life and your economy and those things that would have to sustain the populations. If you defended those pieces first, you don't have to defend the whole continent, the dome idea. You have to defend those specific areas. And if you did that, then you would contribute to this. But you can't do any of that if you can't make the people believe that there's a need. Enter the urgency of the things that, we can talk about Donald Trump and the presidency and 51st state and what that's done to us and everything else. But there was some fundamental truths about Canadian defense and security that existed before Donald Trump that all of us in the defense sphere said, yeah, Canada's really not pulling its weight here and we need to do more. But that it was also matched with a certain naivete, or at least preoccupation in the United States, which still continues on what I call the away game. In other words, their focus of all defense plans in the United States, for the most part, is to fight those fights away. And we in Canada, we pick up on this. Our expeditionary operations still preoccupy our defense mindset. Ask yourself, if we said, okay, 2,200 forces in Latvia right now, expanding to the brigade group, let's take 2,200 people and deploy them to Nunavut. And the Canadian Joint Operations Command would say, yeah, we can't do that. That should send alarm bells around everything. There's 78,000. Yeah, we're short. But if you can't defend your own, which means that continental defense becomes the most important thing. The Russians and the Chinese know this. They know that in North America, we are weak. We are strong elsewhere. When we send our forces overseas, they are strong. They are set. They're trained. But here at home, we're completely weak. That's where they're going to strike first. They're not going to. You don't strike strength on strength. All of the principles of maneuver warfare are that's attritionalist in its mindset. You strike it where the adversary is weakest, and we're weakest at home. That's why the urgency. And to get after that urgency, especially the funding around this, you're going to have to convince the Canadian people that this is important right now.
And we're led to believe that the Carney government has already been in conversation at a very high level, not very specific about it. You read Donald Trump's social media, you'd think that we're banging on the door to get in on the deal. But so somewhere in between, I imagine, is where the conversation's happening. At the same time, when we start to talk about this level of sort of national engagement, we'll call it, at the risk of calling it patriotism, where we have been moved over the last number of months, and we all, I think, fundamentally understand that our relationship with the United States, economically, et cetera, is in a reset mode. That in fact we're going to have to rethink how we do all of these things. Defense is another thing. But the Arctic, and you talked about putting, those troops in Nunavut, the Arctic has become sort of that focal point of, if we're going to do anything, that's where it needs to happen. All of these things together, it's the old line that you don't want to waste a good crisis. Are we at that stage here where we're able to say, okay, these things are converging at a point in our history where, in fact, this is beginning to turn heads among the citizenry to say, all right, if we're going to do it, let's get it done and do it right?
Yeah, I'm not convinced, and I'm not convinced because I spent 37 years watching, even after the goodwill of Afghanistan and everything else, successive governments on both sides of the aisle say, "Oh, we're going to do this. Here's the promise. Here's the promise. Here's the promise." we can't get it through Treasury Board. That funding, instead of $10 billion in 1 year, it's, spread over 20, which becomes a trickle, which therefore in the programmatics gets lost. And then there's $1 billion in defense cuts announced the next day. Like, these are things that happen. Like, someone says, no, we're the Liberal government. We've announced all these expansions and the new defense policy and all the rest of stuff. Cut $1 billion out of your defense budget. Oh, but we're not going to impact operations and readiness. What? Okay. So I've seen all of this. I have a sense of disbelief with respect to that. I think we're at that watershed moment. I don't think the Canadian people are at that watershed moment. They're having a visceral reaction to south of the border, but they're saying, hey, 3.5 years isn't a long time. We can wait this out. And then we'll just go back to being the way we were before. Funny enough, I saw this same kind of approach after 9/11. Okay, no, the world hasn't changed. We're just going to go back to this. And those of us in the defense and security sphere knew that this was a fundamental shift in world policy, as it was the end of the war on terror and this turn back to great power competition and where we're at. But I really do think that we have to take advantage of this, and hence the reason why, I'm happy about shows and things like this. I think the Canadian Arctic provides a very unique thing, especially for Canada, as it pertains to sovereignty. And as a lightning rod, I like it. I've been kind of outspoken of saying defending North America and Arctic sovereignty or Arctic security, they're cross-pollinated, but they're, to a certain extent, they're mutually exclusive. I can defend North America without actually defending the Arctic. Like, a bunch of cruise missiles and things like this go off around the Arctic archipelago. For the most part, we're all going to go, oh, okay. Like, that's it. Like, there's no impact at all. And that same would not be the same, being said if those things started popping off around Southern Ontario or Quebec or the lower mainlands. But that doesn't mean that the Arctic's any less important. It just means that it's different in what you defend and how you defend it. The thing in reality about NORAD is if you're defending everything, you're defending nothing. So that reality kind of comes home to roost. The reason why I like the Arctic is because it's a lightning rod for Canadian popular thought. Everybody looks at the Arctic as a sense of pride. Funny enough, people in the South talk so much more about the Arctic than they would ever visit it, right? Like, very few people. I've traveled extensively across, right? I've flown in and around Ellesmere Island and been up at Alert often enough to say, I've got lots of stories about that stuff, but very few people actually have. So they don't really have a sense of the size, the scope, the distance, the nature of the populations that are up there, and then the difficulties it is to develop infrastructure and all the things that you'd need to really establish the presence that sovereignty is going to demand in the future. That's why it's a lightning rod thing, because Canadians think deeply about it. We cherish the Arctic as part of us. Therefore, I think they would be willing to spend the monies that focus on that thing, and it reorients, I believe, our defense off of that away game back onto defense of Canada at home. All defense policy has two imperatives and one choice. The two imperatives are: you must defend Canada, you must defend North America, and everything else is a choice. That means NATO is a choice, but NORAD is not. And neither is that relationship with the United States. So when I see kind of announcements like the over-the-horizon radar, $6 billion, the satellite ground stations, the operational northern support hubs, the year-round military presence, that the Carney government, these are the major initiatives that pertain specifically to the Arctic. You can add submarines, icebreakers, airborne early warning aircraft. This is all about moving the Canadian defense sphere into the north. But I think in the area of infrastructure, dual purpose infrastructure, that could serve, I think of runways, roads, telecommunications infrastructure, all of those things that a defense and security person would need to operate also serves the local population. It's also going to serve industry and economics. It's also going there, like right there. That is real dollars. 2% GDP is a goal, but when you're spending it on dual purpose infrastructure, it's still defense spending, right? So to me, I think there's some real things here that we can do that can help the Indigenous populations that are there, the Canadian economy that's there, Canadian business opportunities that could be there in the Arctic, and at the same time, advancing Canadian sovereignty. That's why I think the Arctic and Arctic security is so important at this moment, because I think it might be the pivot point upon which that Canadian urgency can actually turn.
It's funny. You're echoing exactly what I heard from Sean Boyd, is the chairman at Eco Eagle, around dual purpose infrastructure. And he turns it around. And that's what he talks about in terms of the mining sector in the Arctic and in Nunavut particularly, where they have built a mine and a community around that mine. And there's a landing strip that goes with that mine because they've got to get their product in and out. And it becomes dual purpose because eventually, Meadow Lake is going to close down. They're not going to be able to mine there anymore, but it doesn't mean that the infrastructure that's there is not going to be of use. And he has talked about sort of flipping that and saying, okay, national defense, here, we'll sell it to you for $1.
Yep.
Why don't you use it? It can handle a Hercules aircraft, right? I mean, it cuts both ways. So, while defense could be doing that for the benefit of the community is already in that place. Mm-hmm. Business is already in that place, creating that infrastructure that would accelerate the opportunities for our national defense in the Arctic. No?
You'd think. So, as the guy who's the pragmatic operator, my job really wasn't to, it was to plan the long-term sphere of the Air Force, for a couple of years. But at the same time, it was to execute on operations right now for the most part, create real readiness, real defense. To me, these become opportunities, but they have to become opportunities for entire government, not just one department. And the programmatics of the federal government get in the way here. Department of National Defense is going to be given an airfield. Here's $1. Okay, you're going to be given no additional funds to maintain your already existing Air Force wings. Now maintain that airfield, Air Force. Okay, Army, yep, you're going to be given no additional funds to maintain all of your militia barracks and everything on all of that infrastructure you have across the entire country, but maintain the barracks and the systems that are up there. And you're going, hold on now. Eco might have bought that or sold that to us for $1, and that might, come with some intrinsic, value with it, but it comes with an annual cost to us. So give us the money to be able to maintain this, and then it's going to become to what standard, to what, oh gosh, and then the Department of National Defense doesn't control many of the things that are around this. It's the Defense Construction Agency that which is outside of the department, right? Or it's the IT communications, which again doesn't necessarily belong to defense because that unclassified backbone belongs to another department. And all of a sudden this becomes problematically impossible to do. I use the case of the Inuvik runway as the classic lightning rod for this. For years, we tried to say it was the number one thing that had to get done because it had a direct operational impact and it was going to service and allow wide-body jets to get into Inuvik. So those two things go hand in hand. I can get A310, so an Airbus, in there. That's our Polaris aircraft that can do long-range refueling, but can also have significant amounts of cargo. Or I can get the C-17s in there. And at the same time, the local community can be serviced by a 737 that might be able to get more economy. Like all of a sudden, everything gets bigger. But because it was at the nexus of two departments, no, it got no more priority. And if we put it forward as our number one priority, we might lose the entire expanse of that budget and that budget money away from defense infrastructure. So it could never get put forward. It was always put off to the side as a dual purpose thing and never got funded by any of the departments. So process and fairness and all of these things and overwatching and the Canadian dollar and expensive taxpayer is preventing us from doing the right thing, with preventing us from having a long range vision because the bureaucrats are working in their lanes. They're working of these things. And the longer this lasts, the better that this works. And I'm sorry, it's not that I don't have a love for the public service. I do. But these processes, I don't know how many times I said, that's what's right. Just do it. And you couldn't get there from here. And I just keep going, how far up the food chain do I have to get before I can just order things to happen? And they just do. So opportunities like that in the Arctic, I think there are many. And I think that the government just has to issue very specific direction. You will partner with industry. If they give you an opportunity, you will tell us why you're not taking advantage of that opportunity, you don't have to ask permission to take advantage of that opportunity. Now move. Problem is most civilian organizations don't work that way. They work with process and written things. And Treasury Board ends up being, right, the gateway to getting any of this stuff done.
So does this system need to be broken and rebuilt? I mean, do we need one throat to choke on this to make it work?
Well, so yes and no. I get worried about breaking systems because I like our institutions. I like the checks and balances. All you got to do is watch what's happening south of the border to say that the more that you erode your institutions and the power of your institutions, but at the same time, there has to be a greater sanity that goes on top of this, that allows for people to have a greater sense of innovation and opportunity inside of government to be able to get after some of these things and the opportunities they present themselves. Because there's going to be no easy answers, especially in the Arctic. Anybody who lives in the north, right? It takes longer. It costs 10 times more. Keep on going with all of the problems. It's seasonal and its infrastructure development. All of those things that are somewhat lost on people that sit in, either lower provinces, or especially in the federal government, right? They understand it intellectually, but they don't understand that this comes home to roost as to how you have to do business. Being able to cross-pollinate across those spheres, to be able to say the Department of Indigenous Affairs and the Department of National Defense, and okay, here's the guidance and here's how I want you to do these things. They operate in those stovepipes. It's trying to find mechanisms that they can fuse themselves together. And then it's going to be not fighting for the dollars to be able to do that, but the government up front saying, it's like the carrot and stick thing. Here's the funding to be able to do things like these. Show me the things you're going to do, and the funding will be there. And by the way, here's the advantages that they are for, you three departments. You don't have to fight over the funding. It's there, but only if you work together. And that's the kind of lightning rod that I think needs to be done. But it's going to have to be tough work inside a cabinet, because for the most part, each one of the departments, they're fighting for their funding. This goes back to that sense of urgency. You don't have that sense of urgency if you're not willing to cut defense, because the numbers are extraordinary. Just on the defense sphere, we say 2% GDP. Okay. All the parties in the election said they're going to get to 2% GDP by 2030. Mark Carney just announced $8 billion increase in the defense spending. And we'll reach not quite 2% GDP by 2030. Okay, here we go. It's 1.73, percent is that they're projected. So they're not going to meet it. Yes, they're going to increase defense spending by another 0.5%, but they're not going to hit it. And by the way, in the same time, where the Secretary General of NATO at the summit here in the spring is going to say the new goal is 5%. So the Canadian government is not. It's a lot of money to increase this annually. Just to give everybody a sense to this, the current defense spending is $33 billion. That's what we spend on defense. You'd have to increase that by $15 billion annually to reach 2%. That's almost 50% of the current defense budget as an increase. Here's Scott's kind of take on all of this. If you don't see significant infrastructure changes into the Arctic, then none of this is going to change. If you don't see personnel expansion, note I didn't say just recover where the Canadian Armed Forces is short, because we've got recruiting and retention issues in the Canadian Armed Forces that leaves us about 14,000 people short right now. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about expanding the size of the Canadian Armed Forces. If you don't see that, then you're never going to meet those defense goals, because those are the real things that cost money, and they cost money over time. But once you do that, once you hire soldiers, once you expand the census, once you spend that infrastructure, you have to sustain it. Both of those, that takes choice away from government. Right? It's not a program that you can spend on, okay, and then the spend is gone, or I can make a choice on whether I want to do this or scale down those operations. That's why they haven't mandated a permanent presence with an actual base in the north with people living there full time. They talk about hubs, because if they actually had to put people and their families in the north, the expense would be extraordinary, and they'd have no choice after that. They'd be locked in. And this is where I see successive governments not wanting to invest, especially in the Arctic.
The only thing that you may take away in terms of positivity around it is the Prime Minister's decision to issue a singular mandate letter, and that all the message being every cabinet minister has to work under these 7 principles. So maybe they're getting to that point. It's a long way to go yet, but at least there seems to be a singular attitude, Scott, in terms of these are our priorities. And I don't care what department or office you're sitting in, everything must be, to the furtherance of these 7 items on this list. So get the freaking job done. Maybe that's a start.
I think it absolutely is. So to be clear, and I wrote a book on leadership. If I was going to kind of walk through the things that the prime minister is doing, he's doing everything right. He's saying the right things, but he's being Canadian about it. He didn't interrupt Donald Trump 25 times so that he could get drawn into a blowout with JD Vance in the middle of the Oval Office. No, but he said the right things that Canadians needed to hear, as much as he was speaking to Canadians as he was the rest of the world. He's standing up for Canada, but he's doing it in a respectful way that said, I'm not going to dumb down to your level of bullying. I'm just going to say, yeah, no. And then I'm going to let my body language say the rest. And that's the kind of respectful way that most people in the world want us to deal with them as far as that stability is concerned. I don't want you coming at me with every single thing that you don't like about my nation on a diplomatic sphere, but I don't mind us having pointed private conversations about this. So from a leadership point of view, he's doing everything right. The singular mandate letter, and that what I will say as someone who's led a lot of complex teams is if the prime minister does not empower those elements within his cabinet and then further down those people inside of the departments to be able to get on with those interesting things, the Amico opportunity, the Eagle opportunity with that runway and infrastructure. There's a classic example. If everybody has to ask permission, you're always going through so many wickets that this becomes impossible. If you cannot get to this so that there's an approval strategy, so that it's how do we make this work, not here's the 100 ways why that's not going to work, right? Those are 2 different conversations. We tend to have always the negative conversation on this in government. If he's not going to empower the people beneath him to be able to do that, then he's going to be micromanaging this, and it's always going to fall apart, because the innovators are just going to say, why would I want to work in this? Every time I present something, you give me the 10 reasons why I can't. So instead of that, I'm going to go work somewhere else.
Yeah, we just did a series. It's called Creating Space, and it's about economic reconciliation. And we went with that perspective, and that was to say, we know there are problems, so let's not start with the problem vis-a-vis. Let's not start with the why you can't do this. Where are the solutions? And it was a really remarkable, refreshing conversation.
So there's an age-old thing that those of us in military planning have seen for a lot of times, and it's when you come up to the courses of action that you're going to do with this and you want ideas, you put a cost on negativity. And for me, it was just, okay, it's 10 push-ups. What? So when you're sitting around
Right.
a table of people in suits and things like this, and you walk into a room, and it's easy when you're dealing with a helicopter squadron or an infantry battalion or something like this. It's really tough when I'm sitting around with a bunch of suits and civilian military folks going, okay, look, I need the good ideas. What solves this? What are out there? And someone says, okay, well, what about this? And the person in the corner goes, whatever comment you go, drop and give me 10. What? Yeah, you and your tie, drop and give me 10. And you're going to think twice. And then the fun part is the second round. It's like, okay, all these ideas, and we put people's names beside them. Now you're not allowed to support them. I just want to know what's wrong with them. Why? Because we're going to make them better. And then the first person that supports it, well, it was my idea and it was really good. Okay, drop and give me 10. By the time you come around to, and now we're just going to find fixes for all of these problems that we resolved with the first one, you're going to start to coalesce into some really good ideas. And you're going to get away from the emotional attachment to all these things, and you're going to start innovating. And this is innovation and collaboration are at the essence of who we are as humans. We want to work together. That's how we survive. Darwin knows this, right? So the answer is, let's get past all of this ego and process and all the rest of the stuff that we got to real collaboration. If Mark Carney can engender that, that's the secret sauce, quite honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think at some stage, the last couple of weeks, it's just felt like we're at a point now where there is a hope and some sense of opportunity is within grasp, that there is a horizon there that we can see, and that in fact maybe we're off on the right footing again. Well, I think generally speaking, we have a functional government, so we're taking that as the low bar, but it's a functional government again, and we'll go from there. Yeah. Scott Clancy, it's always great to talk to you. Thanks for taking time with us.
Thanks, Dave. It's always great to be here.
All right, well, that'll do it for us. It is Now and Next, and if you are watching on the YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. You get this. You also get On the Ledge. Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, John Wright, Keith Leslie drop in. We'll be recording that session tomorrow, and plenty to talk about. Last week, we got into this discussion around Bill 5, and I have rarely seen legislation at Queen's Park, or any legislative assembly for that matter, that is just sort of named so anonymously, Bill 5. Well, what does it mean? There are more people who are talking about this in the province of Ontario because it gets into questions of get her done. Are we going to build mines? Are we going to actually build infrastructure? We're going to get all these things done around housing and transportation, but the process around it is the issue. And fundamentally, I think the government at Queen's Park has misplayed its hand around this, and they are now being forced to look at amendments because it has completely upset the apple cart as far as Ford Nation and the Indigenous nations are concerned in this province, particularly around the Ring of Fire. And while the minister now is saying we're prepared to come back with some amendments, members of the First Nations communities affected are saying, not good enough. You got to start from scratch. We want this done, but not this way. So that might come up in our conversation this week on the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. So subscribe to the channel. You get both shows, and it would be great to have you part of the crew. And if you've got something to say, feel free, leave us a comment. That'll do it. I'm Dave Trafford. This is Now and Next for Story Studio Network.